Hey, you're listening to the Labor Radio Podcast, weekly produced by the Labor Radio Podcast Network, laborradionetwork.org. I'm Chris Garlock. On this week's show,
Act 10's restrictions on collective bargaining were put on, public employees like teachers, grad students, state employees, city employees, but firefighters and police officers retained their right to collectively bargain. And so this was unequal because there were two different classes of employees.
The We Rise Fighting podcast interviews Madeline Topf, co-president of the Graduate Workers Union in Madison, Wisconsin, about Act 10 and its reversal last week.
Most members have some connection to the sit-down strikes, to the 1930s, to the iconic founding of this union. Not everyone is a nerd reading about CIO history and all that, but Walter Reuther as a name means something.
It's been a new day in the United Auto Workers since the election of Shawn Fain as president in 2023, with the union carrying out an aggressive organizing and political programming that's established the UAW as a major presence in American life. On the Reinventing Solidarity podcast, New Labor Forum's Micah Uetricht spoke to Jonah Furman, a top aide to Fain, about the union's strategy, its various wins and losses among non-union auto manufacturers in the American South, its relationship to the Democratic Party under President Joe Biden, and the impact of a Donald Trump presidency on the union and labor as a whole.
What we really need to talk about is Joe Biden going into that bookstore in Nantucket and buying 100 Years War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1717 by Rashidi Khalidi.
The Art and Labor podcast folks have thoughts, yes they do, on the CEO shooter, Wicked, and seeing the Bidens in a bookstore.
At 23, I thought this was just about the funniest thing I had ever seen. It seemed so ballsy and mischievous and silly. And I thought, this is what it is. This is what the world's about. It's like a guy's yelling and you just take his keys and you lob them into the grass. But I think now I would have a different reaction.
Live in front of a seductive studio audience, Sarah and Max bring to a climax the first intoxicating season of What Do We Want?, a podcast about what brings social movements together and what drives them apart.
The amount of ADs and PAs who have told me, oh my God, I had to choreograph a sex scene way back because there was no one to do it. And people were like, hey, will you just do that? They're like, thank goodness you're here.
Intimacy coordinators are an essential part of creating safe and professional working environments on movie sets, acting as advocates and liaisons between actors and production for scenes involving nudity, simulated sex, and other intimate acts. Last month, intimacy coordinators unanimously agreed to join SAG-AFTRA in a National Labor Relations Board vote. To discuss why this matters and what it means for the future of the profession and the entertainment industry at large, the SAG-AFTRA podcast is joined by intimacy coordinators Claire Warden and Erin Tillman, who were instrumental in the recent vote to unionize.
If you walked into a high school basketball arena and it were filled with small desks, and you could imagine men with kind of Panama brimmed hats sitting there with cigars in their mouths and tobacco leaves on a table, that is a similar image as to what you would see.
Labor History Today producer Patrick Dixon talks with historian Sarah McNamara about her book Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, which tells the story of immigrant and U.S.-born Latinas and Latinos who organized strikes, marched against fascism, and criticized U.S. foreign policy.
He took seriously the idea of what the world would need to be like in order to have superheroes in it. How would they change it? And also, what would the conditions need to be to produce them?
Alan Moore is one of the most important comic book and graphic novel creators in the business. The Green and Red podcast discusses how Moore's work, including The Watchmen and V for Vendetta, has subverted literary and comic book genres and put radical ideas into the mainstream. That's all coming up, plus Harold's shows you should know on this week's jam-packed edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. As usual, let's get started with Harold's quick rundown of shows you should know.
Thanks, Chris. Social media guy Harold Phillips here again, folks. And look, I know a lot of you are anti-capitalist, but a lot of you are still trying to do your holiday shopping. And even though we live in an era where you can do a lot of that online, well, clock's ticking as to whether you're going to be able to get that delivered in time or not. So a bunch of you are going to be headed to the stores. Now look, you could listen to the 175th hour of Christmas music that your local radio station is playing. Believe me, a radio station near me started playing it in October. Or you could listen to something that's a little bit more focused on working people's issues. Here are a few shows you should know for the week of December 8th. Our first one is all about the buying and selling. Laura Walton, president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, discusses Donald Trump's plans for a 25% tariff on goods from Canada on Radio Labor Canada. Richie talks about building better grievance files, writing effective statements, and more on a new addition to the network, Hot House with Richie Ray. We Work Europe released 3 podcasts over the past week. First, the show takes on the case of Adela S. from Spain as it dives into escaping the spiral of violence in the workplace. Then Anne Lurie Humbert takes a closer look at the results of a study investigating sexualized violence in the academic environment. And finally, the International Labor Organization's Victor Hugo Rico discusses Convention 190, which for the first time addresses sexualized violence in the workplace internationally. Madison Labor Radio shares stories on the alteration of Wisconsin's Act 10, Trump's pick for Secretary of Labor, arrests at a pro-Palestine rally, and more. And finally, David Scarpa discusses Gladiator 2, crafting historical epics, the creative challenges of sequels, and more on the Writers Guild of America West's 3rd and Fairfax. And where can you find links to all these shows and over 200 more labor radio shows and podcasts? Head to laborradionetwork.org. And if you're looking to find out what the latest episodes of these shows are, follow us on social media at Labor Radio Net. On Facebook, Instagram, we're still on Twitter, and yes, we're now on Blue Sky. All right, Chris, back to you, and hey, everybody be safe out there as you head to the malls. And do your best to buy American and buy union.
Thanks, Harold. All right, let's go to Madison, Wisconsin for We Rise Fighting.
All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor Podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. As always, I'm Rico Rutia, here with my co-host, Brian Pfeiffer. All right, what's up, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor Podcast. This week, we actually have a double header of sorts. We're going to be talking with 2 labor leaders who have been on the show before. In this case, it's going to be Madeline Topf, and in the other episode, we're going to talk with Brother Mike Jones, and we're going to be talking about Act 10, its passage in 2011, which, for those of you who don't know, Act 10 was a piece of anti-labor legislation that was pushed forward by then-Governor Scott Walker. And last week, it was reversed in Wisconsin, so that's actually why we're talking with Madeline Topf and Brother Mike Jones this week, just to see what that's all about and what that means. And so just to refresh my own memory and to refresh the memory of our listeners, Madeline, could you tell us a little bit about Act 10 and bring us to today? What happened?
Yeah, so Act 10 was a really horrible anti-union law in Wisconsin that was passed in 2011. It pretty much eliminated collective bargaining for public employees in the state, including grad students like myself. And we had a successful challenge to Act 10 recently where we made kind of a legal argument against it. And this was kind of upheld. So this lawsuit was successful. And the legal argument essentially was that Act 10's restrictions on collective bargaining were put on, public employees like teachers, grad students, state employees, city employees, but firefighters and police officers retained their right to collectively bargain. And so this was unequal because there were two different classes of employees. Additionally, game wardens, Capitol Police, other types of law enforcement that didn't support Scott Walker at the time were subject to Act 10. So this is kind of really the crux of the argument, is that there's law enforcement or public safety employees that do have collective bargaining and that don't under Act 10. So it's unequal. And so this argument was successful. And so here we are today. This decision will likely be appealed, but it's a really major win for Wisconsin and for unions.
Thank you again, Madeline, for being on the show again. Love and solidarity to all. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Welcome to Reinventing Solidarity, a podcast of the journal New Labor Forum at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York. My name is Micah Uetricht, podcast host and editor-at-large at New Labor Forum. The 2023 leadership shift in the United Auto Workers, with the election of reformer Shawn Fain to the presidency after years of embarrassing corruption scandals that reached the union's highest levels, brought a major change in the orientation, strategy, and energy of America's most storied industrial union. I interviewed Jonah Furman, a top aide to Shawn Fain, about the union's new approach. In the heyday of industrial unionism and throughout the 20th century, the UAW really played a vanguard role in channeling working class energy into organizing campaigns, advancing labor militancy, and pushing a progressive agenda within the larger labor movement. Fain seems to embrace that role for the UAW today. What is your assessment of the UAW's role in setting the tone and the agenda for the U.S. labor movement?
I think one thing that's really great about the UAW and coming in to work with the members is it's a union with a really deep connection to its own history. And that, we called the campaign at the Big Three last year became the stand-up strike. That was partly a reference to the sit-down strike. And it's not just, in this union, it's not academic. There's a lot of education that happens, but you really don't have to go out and explain. Most members have some connection to the sit-down strikes, to the 1930s, to the iconic founding of this union. And they don't know, not everyone is a nerd reading about CIO history and all that, but Walter Reuther as a name means something in this union. It's really great to see. There's this rich history and culture in the union of that legacy of leading. And it's not just from the 30s and the New Deal, but into the civil rights movement and, the March on Washington and all these historical moments that still feel really alive for a lot of our members, many of whom are second, third, fourth generation auto workers, and work at a lot of them, our big chunk still work at the same companies that their grandparents worked at. So here on Fain talk all the time about 3 of his 4 grandparents worked at, Chrysler and GM. And so being able to tap into that identity and that history really drives that sense in the union that we can play that role, that we have played that role of leading the labor movement in a certain direction, whether that's in politics or strike activity, or, this was the union that invented cost of living allowances and won that inflation protection, that won pensions and healthcare, right? All of these victories were UAW victories. Polling from the AP said that 75% of Americans stood with us, which, in the auto bailout of 2008, 2009, we had 45% of Americans siding with the union. So we're in this moment where there's way more public support and a lot of public inspiration around that. And I think we as the UAW see that somebody has to lead this. It's not going to only be us. If it's only us, we're sunk. But somebody has to step up and raise expectations and go on offense. So I think that's sort of that legacy plus a willingness to take risks in the face of serious opposition is what you're seeing.
Jonah Furman, thank you very much.
Thanks, Micah.
Up next, the Art and Labor Podcast, folks, with thoughts on Wicked and seeing the Bidens in a bookstore.
Okay, that's enough commenting. We're going to get canceled for that. Marshall Moran, co-host of Art and Labor, a podcast that we're retiring now and now becoming a full-time Wicked podcast. What is your take on Wicked?
I'm Wicked. You're Wicked. We're all Wicked. It's Wicked Fall. Like, we had Brad Summer, and now it's Wicked Winter. It's Wicked Winter. Okay, we're doing Wicked Winter. Look, Brad Summer was wrong. We were wrong. But Wicked Winter is going to do it. We got it this time, everybody. We just got to do it a little bit more. We're going to do more Wicked. But I loved it, honestly.
I knew that. I knew that before. I was my tweet before I saw it was that it's Brat Winter. It's a like this is the reification of Brat Summer into something new. So we're not going to talk about Wicked. We're not going to talk about movie takes anymore. Maybe a little bit, but we just don't have time. And because what we really need to talk about is Joe Biden going into that bookstore in Nantucket and buying what is it called? 100 Years War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1717 to 2017, by Rashidi Khalidi, which is like one of the bestsellers like at my job, and certainly like in general right now. But it's not like type of New York Times-y bestseller. I don't know.
No, it's like an academic press book. Like it's not necessarily the like, oh, this is written for just your average audience in mind. Like it's definitely like a higher tier of like, oh, you're going to write a paper on this in a seminar class kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's definitely like not the president's political agenda at all. It's like it's the opposite, and it's a clear signal of some sort, and like, you know, people I'm sure are like giving him a way too generous read of it, like people who are like being optimists or whatever. But I think it's cool to be optimistic right now about it. Like it could signal some good stuff. It could signal a big fuck you to the Netanyahus, who are getting like a lot of bad press right now in general.
I think also, speaking of Catholic guilt, another horny hot thing is the fact that his son Hunter was seen with him buying this book, which is, like I said, hot. Hunter Biden is the most attractive man in America, but that's not my point.
You're such a mess. I did like the detail that Hunter hugged an employee of the store.
Really? He did?
That made me feel very like, would that be me?
And we'll be back with more movie takes soon.
Let's have fun, everyone. Goodbye.
Hello, I'm Sarah, and this is What Do We Want, a podcast about the weird, wild, and wacky things that bring social movements together and drive them apart.
And my name is Max. Today on our show, we are talking about our guilty pleasures, whether they are orgasms or getting arrested or both at the same time, and how that can help our movements, as well as questions of value and of sacrifice.
And we are very lucky today to have not just one, but two guests with us on this podcast. First, we have Sita Balani, Dr. Sita Balani, who is the author of Deadly and Slick, Sexual Modernity and the Making of Race from Verso Press. And we also have Zrinka Bralo. Zrinka is the CEO of Migrants Organize, an advice and campaigning organizing platform for migrant justice.
We thought we might start today's podcast recording by asking a very difficult question, which is, what is our most guilty pleasure from activism? Sarah, begin.
Okay.
Let us know.
Well, I was telling Max earlier at lunch that I enjoy looking down upon other activist groups that I think are ineffective, which is which is mean and bitchy of me. And I was telling him about a particular time where there was a group that, even though I agreed with their general issue-based orientation, I felt that they were ineffective for two reasons. Firstly, I thought they were too wishy-washy and all about feelings. And secondly, a lot of them were having sex with each other. And over time, the group shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And I was still on one of their WhatsApp groups, but I would never open the messages because I didn't want to show that I was involved anymore in any way. So I didn't want the red, signal to come up in the thread. But WhatsApp drops images into your photos. So I could still see when they would leave photos of their activism because it would show up in my photos drive. And then I would, in a very Schadenfreude enjoying it way, look at the photos and be like, oh, there's only 4 of them and those 2 are having sex with each other. And I would look down upon their organizing. And I know that this is bad, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you're totally going to get canceled for that. I want to ask a follow-up question, which is if any of you have a story about something that you did or that you witnessed in a movement or movement space that was surprisingly pleasurable.
I have a little story that I could throw into the mix. So it would have been 2010, and there was either a teachers or a wider public sector strike. I can't remember which it was. And I was maybe 23, so in a more kind of anarchist-oriented moment in my life, and there was a critical mass in the morning during rush hour. There was probably 30 of us on bikes going round and round the Elephant and Castle roundabout at 8 a.m. And so all of the traffic, all of the different kind of lead-in points to the roundabout were all stopped there. And I felt this kind of tremendous feeling of like power and excitement that all it took was a few people on bikes and you could just be like, the city has stopped. And then the police turned up, which is kind of what you'd expect to happen, or at least what me now would expect to happen. Me at 23 was like, oh, look who's here. This is weird. So they turned up, and then we were at one of the kind of roads that enter the roundabout, and there was a guy in a lorry, and he was fuming. I've never seen a man so angry, I don't think. And so he was yelling at the cops that they had to arrest us or move us along in some way. They were saying, there's not that much we can do with all of these crazy cyclists. We don't like it either, but just like, they'll get bored and go. And I saw someone who was on a bike. I'd never met them before. The driver was out on the street yelling, and this person put their hand into the cab of his lorry, pulled out his keys, and chucked them. At 23, I thought this was just about the funniest thing I had ever seen. It seemed so ballsy and mischievous and silly. And I thought, like, yeah, this is what it is. This is what the world's about. Like, it's like a guy's yelling and you just take his keys and you lob them into the grass. But I think now I would have a different reaction. So I suppose there's also the question for me of, like, what forms of pleasure... That was funny. To be fair, it was funny. But at the same time, I'm not sure now I would think, yes, let's piss off this guy. I don't think at this moment in my life I would think he was the person I wanted to antagonise. And I think at 23 I did. Because he was yelling and I felt that he was trying to shut down our fun. But actually, I'm not sure that's really what it takes to build a kind of meaningful movement. So I kind of give you that as a kind of ambivalent story, I suppose, in which I did take some pleasure from it, but I'm not sure it did that much to build a left project.
Thanks for listening. This is What Do We Want? And this episode was on pleasure.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SAG-AFTRA Podcast. I'm Duncan Crabtree-Ireland, SAG-AFTRA National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator. Last month, intimacy coordinators unanimously agreed to join SAG-AFTRA in a historic National Labor Relations Board vote, with 100% voting in favor of unionizing with SAG-AFTRA. Intimacy coordinators are an essential part of creating safe and professional working environments on set, acting as advocates and liaisons between actors and production on scenes that involve nudity and simulated sex or other intimate and hyper-exposed scenes. To talk about what this vote means and its implications for the future of the profession, I am joined by Claire Warden, an intimacy director and coordinator who's been instrumental in developing industry standards, and Erin Tillman, an intimacy coordinator serving on our Los Angeles local sexual harassment prevention committee. Welcome, Claire. Welcome, Erin, and welcome to the SAG-AFTRA family as intimacy coordinators now represented by SAG-AFTRA.
Thank you. Like, if you've built your career and done really well in one way, and then someone says, you have to change something, that can be scary. But I think what people are really starting to realize is that this is a change that can actually be so helpful, that can actually relieve so much stress and pressure and expectation and weight from the director, from the first aide, from the DP, right? We're actually in there to help make these scenes better in the same way as you get some incredible stunt coordinators that might come in to help create a piece of violence, or you'll get some incredible movement experts that will come in when you're doing the zombie movie and we want to make it look like or Planet of the Apes, and we want to help the actors safely, sustainably play that role. It's an expertise that is now taking pressure off a lot of people and having the focus on something that might have got dropped before because everybody else is trying to do their job. This is here to help actors and all the creative and the production crew. Let's learn about it and figure out what it can bring.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that too. I mean, the amount of ADs and PAs who have told me, oh my God, I had to choreograph a sex scene way back because there was no one to do it. And people were like, hey, will you just do that? Like, they're like, thank goodness you're here. People know that this is an awkward thing. And really, there should be a specialized group of people helping make actors feel safe in this, so bad things don't happen or to mitigate and lessen harm.
To add to that, the number of directors that have been like, I don't quite know how to say this to them, but we need this. And we've got you. We'll facilitate that.
What really drove that movement? Why was that important to intimacy coordinators?
After a number of years of this is how we can serve the industry and this is how we can help the actors, the creatives, the crew, and the enormous amount of labor and unpaid labor, time, energy, literal blood, sweat, and tears that intimacy coordinators across the country and across the world were putting into building this movement, it became clear that building a career for an intimacy coordinator that is sustainable, that means that we can have health care. I'll be really honest here. I haven't had health care for half of this year because I've been working solely as an intimacy director and coordinator, and we don't have any protection. So I am unprotected because it's incredibly expensive to have healthcare when you're not connected to an organization. And so it's those basic protections and unity, because then we can all be like, well, these are our minimum fees. All the things that the unions bring for us allows us not only for the people that are working now to be sustainable, but also to build this as a career that many generations can come afterwards. So every production, wherever it is in the world, that has an intimate scene or nudity or something like that, knows that they can have the full support they deserve, because this is a legitimized and supported career that there are many people that can do it.
So thank you, Erin Tillman. Thank you, Claire Warden, so much for being with us today and talking about ICs. And for all of our listeners, you'll hear from us on the next SAG-AFTRA podcast.
Way down here in Ybor City. Way down Tampa, Florida, down there.
Decades before Miami became Havana, USA, a wave of leftist, radical, working-class women and men from pre-revolutionary Cuba crossed the Florida Straits, made Ybor City the global capital of the Cuban cigar industry, and established a foundation of Latinidad in the Sunshine State. Located on the eastern edge of Tampa, Ybor City was a neighborhood of cigar workers and Caribbean revolutionaries who sought refuge against the shifting tides of international political turmoil during the early half of the 20th century. In her book, Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, historian Sarah McNamara tells the story of immigrant and U.S.-born Latinas and Latinos who organized strikes, marched against fascism, and criticized U.S. foreign policy. I'm Chris Garlock, and this is Labor History Today. Here's producer Patrick Dixon's interview with Sarah McNamara.
What's it like being a cigar worker? Is it more like entering one of the trades where you become like a shoemaker or a tool maker, or is it less like a sort of standard production line then where you're repeating the same task every day? Is it safe? Is it comfortable?
So there were the stereotype of cigar work or handmade cigar work in Ybor City, as well as Key West, and even in places like New York prior to mechanization, was that cigar workers looked at their labor as an art. One of the things that I loved reading most when I was writing the book were the oral histories collected by the WPA of this original generation of cigar workers, many of whom hated being cigar workers. Because if you go to Florida and you hear people talk about cigar work, there's this very romantic association attached to it. But when they happen to encounter somebody who wasn't being interviewed by a board of trade, people were very honest about the stress involved in the job and what it was like holding that. So it is a skilled position in what you say, where you are making the same product every day. But your experience of cigar work basically depended on the kind of job you had, as well as who you were. So on a global, perspective, if we're thinking about the actual production of cigars, this happened on the main floor of a cigar factory. You can imagine little desks that are lined up in a giant hall. Like if you walked into a high school basketball arena and it were filled with small desks, and you could imagine men with kind of Panama brimmed hats sitting there with cigars in their mouths and tobacco leaves on a table, that is a similar image as to what you would see. So it very much had this, an industrial feel. As you move into the 20th century, there would oftentimes be a woman sitting next to that man. And what she was doing was she was helping him make cigars faster. So a man who was a cigar worker, right, a tabaquero, a cigar maker. A cigar maker is different than, somebody who's just working in tobacco broadly. But that person would make the cigar from the beginning to the end. So one person was responsible for the act of rolling. However, people got paid by the number of cigars they produced, which is where the stress came in, right? There were also quality checks. So if something were ripped, if it were cracked, if it didn't stand up to, different kinds of inspections, then it would be discarded, which also cost people money. The women sitting next to these men, they would be making what were called bunches. They were called buncheras. The women were called buncheras. They would make the bunches so that they could pass it to the man and he would be able to roll the cigar faster. A bunch is the filler tobacco in the middle.
Historian Sarah McNamara, her new book is Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, published by the University of North Carolina Press. We've got a link in the show notes. And that's it for this week's edition of Labor History Today. You can subscribe to LHT on your favorite podcast app. Even better, if you like what you hear, and we sure hope you do, like it in your podcast app, pass it along, and leave a review. That really helps folks to find the show.
Welcome to the Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red Podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. Bob is off on assignment. But I'm pretty excited about today's episode. We're going to be talking about Alan Moore, who is the creator of many graphic novels, but real known ones that he's done have been the Watchmen and V for Vendetta. And joining me is Christian Williams. Christian, welcome to the Green and Red Podcast.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Yep, Christian has been active in anarchist movements since the 90s. Is most known for a book on the history of police called Our Enemies in Blue, but has also written books about Oscar Wilde and George Orwell, and now Alan Moore. And the book is called The Illuminist Philosophical Explorations
in the work of Alan Moore. It seems he's credited with bringing more adult themes to comics. That kind of brings it out of it being like a medium for teenagers or even younger kids, correct?
And most notably, that happened a little later with his work on Watchmen, which was a standalone graphic novel outside of any other continuity. I mean, now DC is like exploitatively doing like prequels and sequels and
HBO miniseries.
But it was intended as just a standalone comic, not as like a new DC universe or anything like that. And really, he took seriously the idea of what the world would need to be like in order to have superheroes in it. Like, how would they change it? And also, like, what would the conditions need to be to produce them? And then also took seriously, what would these people really be like? Not the sort of idealized golden age or silver age kind of heroes, but like, what would it be like if actual human beings participated in the kinds of things that Batman does, right? And so Watchmen had both a political and a moral sophistication to it that really was unheard of previously. Like there have been sort of gestures toward it in other titles, but it really followed through on the promise of taking the adult theme seriously. Like, now, unfortunately, what came out of that was a whole generation of comics writers who just saw this as license to like put, more sex and violence and, grim, dark themes into every title. And therefore now it's for adults. Moore has looked back on that experience rather unfavorably in terms of, he was trying to do something, he was trying to sort of broaden the range of what would happen with comics, and later creators didn't really fulfill that promise.
All right, everyone else make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.
And that's a wrap for this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. If you've been keeping track at home, we're working to get more shows into each episode. 7 excerpts this week, plus another 5 on Harold's shows you should know. But even those 12 are just a sampling of some of the amazing programs aired over the last week on more than 200 labor radio and podcast shows. They're all part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, shows that focus on working people's issues and concerns. We've got links to all the network shows, laborradionetwork.org. You can also find them. Use the hashtag LaborRadioPod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we'd love to hear what you think of this show. We're doing too much? Are we doing too little? Drop us a note, info@laborradionetwork.org. And remember, you can be part of the network. Maybe this would be a good holiday present. You don't need a microphone. Labor Radio Podcast Network t-shirts are available. They are union made. You will find them in all sizes and 2 colors at laborradionetwork.org. This podcast is recorded under a SAG-AFTRA collective bargaining agreement. The Labor Radio Podcast Weekly was edited this week by Patrick Dixon. I produce the show, and our social media guru always and forever is Mr. Harold Phillips. For the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, this has been Chris Garlock, reminding you to stay active and stay tuned to your local Labor Radio Podcast show. We will see you next week.